I am 71 years old, and for the last 9 years I have been carrying something that most people would say belongs in a psychiatric ward or a tabloid newspaper sitting next to the checkout line at the grocery store. I've thought about telling this story more times than I can count. Sat down to write it out at least a dozen times over the years, got 3 or 4 paragraphs in, then burned the paper or deleted the file. My hands would start shaking. Not from fear, from something harder to name, from the knowledge that once I say it out loud, really say it, all of it, then it becomes a thing that happened. Not just a thing I lived, a thing that exists in the world for other people to pick over and judge and turn into whatever they need it to be. I wasn't ready for that. For a long time, I told myself I'd take it to the grave, that it was mine, that they were mine. In whatever sense a man can claim a thing that wild and that strange. But I'm 71 years old, and I've got a doctor who uses the phrase, "Let's keep an eye on that," more than I'm comfortable with, and I think the grave is close enough now that I owe this story to the air before I go into it. So here I am, talking into a camera my granddaughter set up on a tripod in my living room. She showed me how to upload it to the YouTube. I told her I didn't understand why every video on that website has somebody yelling and pointing at things in the little picture in the corner, and she laughed at me and said, "Grandpa, just talk. Just say what you need to say." So that's what I'm doing. I don't know how the algorithm gods work, and I don't know if the YouTube police are going to take this down because it's too strange or too long or not loud enough. I'm not pointing at anything. I'm just an old man sitting in a chair, and I have a story that deserves to exist before I'm not around to tell it. My name is Dale Kowalski. I spent 11 years in the Army, came back from 2 tours with both legs and most of my hearing, which is more than some of the men I served with can say. I got married, I got divorced. Those 2 facts are related, and I won't spend more time on them than that. I had a farm outside of Clearwater County in northern Minnesota, 93 acres of mixed timber and pasture that I bought in the late 90s, with the money I'd saved and a loan I spent 7 years paying off. The nearest town was 18 miles. The nearest neighbor with a driveway I could see from my property line was 3.5 miles through the woods. I want you to understand that the isolation wasn't an accident. I chose it. I came back from the Army knowing that I did not fit well in places with a lot of people and noise and the expectation that you'd smile at things that weren't funny. The land suited me. The quiet suited me. I had my dogs, 2 shepherd mixes, Bauer and Hendricks, and I had my fields, and I had a wood stove and a generator and a satellite phone for emergencies. I was not a lonely man, exactly. I was a man who had made his peace with solitude and built his life around it. I tell you all of this because what happened next only makes sense if you understand what kind of man I was before it. What I was capable of, what I was hungry for without knowing I was hungry for it. The Army gives you brotherhood and then takes it away, and then you spend the rest of your life trying not to notice the shape of the hole it left. The marriage gave me something for a while, and then that was gone too. And I had built a life that was clean and functional and didn't ask anything from me emotionally, and I was fine. I was absolutely fine. And I want to be honest with you right now, at the very start of this, before I've told you a single thing about them, I want to tell you that it ends badly, not because I think you need the warning, but because I think you deserve the honesty. By the time I get to the end of this story, there will be 2 mounds of frozen earth at the edge of the south tree line on my property, and there will be a section of that forest I have not walked into in 6 years, and there will be a sound I heard one February morning that I will carry for the rest of my life. So, when I tell you about the good years, and there were good years, more than I had any right to expect, I need you to hold both things at once, the warmth and what it cost. That's the only honest way to tell it. It started in the spring of 2015. I'd had a wet March, the kind that turns the creek at the bottom of the property into a serious thing, and the mud was everywhere. And I was doing a fence inspection along the eastern edge of the property where the timber gets thick and the underbrush is rough enough that I use a hand machete to get through parts of it. I was about a quarter mile into the tree line, I know that, because I had a GPS unit on my belt, and I checked it afterward, the way I always checked things afterward when I needed the numbers to hold reality in place when Boer stopped. Not a slow down, not a point. A full stop, all four legs braced, head low, a sound in his chest that I had never heard from him in 9 years of keeping that dog. Boer was not a nervous animal. He'd flushed bears out of the brush without making that sound. Whatever he was hearing or smelling, it was something outside of his categories. I had the machete in my right hand and I put my left on his collar and I stood still and I listened. And what I heard was crying. Not howling, not animal distress in any form I recognized from a decade of wilderness living. Crying. High and wet and effortful. The way something cries when it has been crying for a long time, and the body is exhausted, but the thing that is causing the crying has not stopped. I have heard that sound from men. I recognized it immediately. I stood there for what I think was about 45 seconds, which felt like considerably longer, and then I let go of Bower's collar and I moved toward it. What I found, in a shallow depression in the ground at the base of a downed white pine, would have taken me another 40 minutes and a lot of careful circling to properly describe even then. So I'll start with the facts the way I gathered them. There were 2 of them. They were small, I would estimate at the time somewhere between 30 and 45 pounds each, though I'd learn later that was likely a low guess. They were covered in dark, reddish-brown hair that was matted and filthy and pressed flat against what I could tell were very thin bodies underneath. Their hands were the first thing I really registered. I say hands, and I mean it, not paws, not forelimbs, hands, with 4 long fingers and a thumb, proportioned wrong relative to human hands, the fingers too long, the knuckle structure heavier, but hands. Their faces were pushed into the ground and they were not moving, except for the breathing and the crying. And in that moment, in that first frozen moment of finding them, I thought I was looking at something sick, something injured, something that had lost its mother and was dying. I did not run. I need to tell you that clearly because I think most people would have run, and I don't say that as self-congratulation. I think I didn't run because I was too confused to run, and because Bower had stopped making that chest sound and was instead doing something I had also never seen him do, he sat down. He just sat down next to me in the leaves and looked at them, and I looked at Bower looking at them, and something about that a dog who had braced for a bear sitting down in the presence of these things made me take 1 step forward instead of 1 step back. The one closest to me lifted its head, and I looked into its face. And I am going to tell you exactly what I saw. And I am going to ask you to believe me because I have no reason left to lie and no pride left to protect. It had a face that was more human than anything I had ever seen on a non-human creature. A broad, flat nose, heavy brow, eyes that were amber brown in the afternoon light filtering through the wet spring canopy, and those eyes were looking at me the way a human child looks at something it can't decide about yet. Not blank animal staring. Assessment. Fear and assessment both at once. It made a sound, not the crying, something shorter. Just a quick exhaled note, and the second one lifted its head too. And now both of them were looking at me, and none of us moved for a long time. I said out loud, to 2 creatures I could not name and could not explain, and should have turned around and walked away from easy. I'm not going to hurt you. And I meant it. God help me, I meant every word of it. And that was the first mistake I made. Not the worst one, but the first. Because when you tell something you're not going to hurt it, you're making a promise. And some promises are too large for the person making them to fully understand. I was standing in the mud in the spring forest of northern Minnesota, and I was making a promise to two creatures that the world would spend the next 9 years trying to convince me didn't exist. And I kept it. I kept it as long as I could. That has to count for something. I have to believe it counts for something. I went back to the truck. I got the emergency kit from behind the seat. I had a wool blanket, a water bottle, some jerky and trail mix, and a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic Eddie had since the Army, and never fully stopped carrying. I went back to the depression in the ground. They were still there. They had not moved far, maybe 6 feet deeper into the brush, which told me they had the strength to move, but had chosen not to go far. I set the food and water down at the edge of the depression, and I sat down in the wet leaves about 8 feet away, and I waited. Bauer sat next to me. We waited for almost 2 hours until the light started going orange, and in the last of that light, the smaller one, the one who had lifted its head first, crawled forward on its elbows and ate the jerky. Every piece of it. Then it looked at me. Then it drank the water. Then it looked at me again. And I thought, whatever these things are, whatever this is, I cannot leave them here tonight. I did not have a plan. I did not have a theory. I had a hollow feeling in my chest that I recognized from the Army, from the specific moment when you know that something is about to change everything, and there's nothing to do but walk through it. I fashioned a sling out of the wool blanket, and I moved slowly, and I picked up the one who had eaten carefully, the way you pick up something you're afraid of breaking, not afraid of being hurt by, and it weighed less than I expected, and it was shaking the way a living thing shakes when it is past the point of fighting. The second one followed. Not close. Maybe 10 feet behind me the whole walkout. But it followed. Bauer walked between us, which I still think about, as if he understood what he was doing. I got them both to the barn that night. I put down hay and the blanket, and I left a pan of water and everything I had in the truck that was edible. I closed the barn door. I sat in the cab of the truck in the dark for a long time without starting the engine. I was 59 years old, and I had just done something that I could not undo and could not explain to another living person. And somewhere in the back of my mind, underneath the shock and the confusion, there was something else. Something I am not ashamed to name now, though I would have been ashamed to name it then. There was relief. The specific relief of a man who has been alone for a very long time, and has just been given, without asking for it, something to be responsible for, something that needed him. I sat in the dark truck in front of my barn, and I felt for the first time in years like I had a reason to be awake the next morning. That was the spring of 2015, and for 9 years after that, I organized my entire life around the two of them. I spent the first 3 weeks learning them the way you learn any wild thing, slow, patient, always letting them dictate the distance. I kept them in the barn initially, which was a large post and beam structure I'd converted partially into a workshop and storage space, with a full loft and 2 heavy side doors that could be secured from the outside. I want to be accurate about the space because the space mattered. It was approximately 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a 10-foot ceiling in the main floor and the full loft above. Accessible by a wooden ladder that I would later discover one of them climbed with a facility that made me physically dizzy the first time I watched it. It was not a small space. It was warm enough through the nights with the animals I still kept 3 goats and a pair of draft horses that I used for field work, and it had enough room that 2 young creatures could move and explore without being confined to anything that felt like a cage. I named them on the 3rd day. I am not a sentimental man by habit, but I believe in the power of names. 11 years in the military teaches you that. A named thing becomes a real thing. A real thing becomes a thing you're accountable to. I called the larger one Samuel. Samuel from the Bible, the one who heard the voice in the night and didn't understand what it was at first, and kept going back until he understood. That felt right. The smaller one, the one who had been first to approach me, who watched everything with those amber eyes like the world was a problem to be solved, I called Eve. Because she was the one who reached for the thing that was offered, and because in my experience the ones who reach first carry the most. I told them their names out loud on that third morning, holding out 2 strips of dried venison, and I said, Samuel, this is for you, and Eve, this is for you, and whether they understood the words I cannot say, but Eve's eyes moved when I said it, just slightly, in the way of something that has filed a thing away. They were juveniles. That much was clear from their proportions, the limbs slightly too long for their bodies, the way they moved with an awkward explosive energy that reminded me of adolescent animals that haven't yet grown into their own stride. I estimated them to be somewhere between 2 and 4 years old, which I would later revise significantly. The creature I eventually came to understand them as which I'll call a dogman, for lack of a better word, and because that is what the people who have studied this call it. Whatever that classification is worth does not mature at a human or even a typical mammal rate. By what I know now, they were probably closer to 7 or 8 years into their lives when I found them, which still put them in early stages relative to what they became. Their mother and I knew from the second week that they had had a mother, from the way they moved into each other's space at night, from the low sounds they made when they were distressed, from the way Eve would sometimes go very still and look south through the barn slats for a long time, in a direction I would later walk and find nothing was gone. She had been gone for some time, I think. They were already past the acute starvation stage when I found them, but not far past it. The first practical problem was food, and it was a significant one. I would learn over time that they were capable of subsisting on a wide range of protein, but in those early weeks they needed large quantities of it. I was going through a deer carcass every 4 to 5 days, which meant hunting continuously and keeping a significant reserve. I had a chest freezer in the barn already, and I added a second one within the first month, running it off the barn's dedicated circuit. I told my single semi-regular contact in the area, a man named Harv Pedersen, who ran a bait and tackle shop 18 miles out and sometimes brought me engine parts when I needed them, that I was doing some extra processing for a hunting club and needed to keep some overflow. Harv was not a curious man, and that was one of the things I valued about him. What I was not prepared for, and what changed everything about those first weeks, was the speed of their intelligence. By the end of the first month, Eve had learned that the sound of the chest freezer opening meant food was coming and would position herself in front of it before I reached it. By the end of the second month, Samuel had figured out the interior mechanism of the barn's side latch, not the exterior lock, but the interior toggle, and had opened the door twice in the night, both times waiting calmly in the yard when I came out at 5 in the morning. Not fleeing, not threatening, just standing in the pre-dawn dark and watching me with an expression I can only describe as testing. By the end of the third month, they had learned their names as functional signals. Not as words, I don't think. As tones. Eve's name had a falling pitch and a short duration, and when I said it that way, she would orient to me. Samuel's was harder to get right. He required something more direct, more level, before he'd attend. I did not fully know what I had on my hands. I want to be clear about that. I had a military background and a decade of wilderness experience, and I was still fundamentally outside my depth, and I knew it. There were nights in that first year when I sat in the barn with them, Bauer pressed against my leg, the lantern burning low, Samuel asleep in the hay, with one long arm draped over his eyes, in a gesture so human it made my sternum hurt, and Eve watching the dark beyond the barn slats. and I thought I should call someone. A game warden, a biologist, someone at a university. I thought it every few weeks for the entire first year, and every time I thought it, I looked at Eve's eyes in the lantern light, and I thought about what would happen to them if a government agency or a research institution or, God forbid, the wrong kind of media got involved. I thought about Samuel's arm over his eyes. I thought about the way Eve had come to me in the wet spring leaves and eaten from my hand. And I made my choice. Every time, I made my choice. Looking back, I can see those were the moments I could have changed the ending. I made the same choice every time. By the end of the first year, I had begun to understand what I had. By the end of the second, I had begun to understand what it was costing me, and had decided it was worth it. Year 2 was the year of what I think of as the threshold crossings, the moments when each of them demonstrated something that moved them from the category of remarkable animal into a category I don't have a clean word for. Samuel was first. It was a January morning, temperature somewhere around -14, and I came into the barn at first light to find that he had reorganized the space. I am not speaking loosely. The hay bales I used for their bedding had been moved and restacked, not randomly, but in a specific configuration that created a raised sleeping platform against the east wall with a windbreak of bales on the north-facing side. He had moved objects that weighed close to what I weighed and had arranged them with a logic that was structural. I stood in the barn door for a long time looking at it. Then I said, out loud, "Samuel, did you do this?" And he looked at me from the top of the platform he was lying stretched out on it, and he did something with his face that was not a human expression but was close enough to one that I registered it immediately. A kind of settled, deliberate stillness that communicated yes so clearly that I felt it in my spine. Eve's threshold crossing was quieter and in some ways more disturbing. I had developed a habit, in the evenings, of talking to them while I worked in the barn, not directed conversation, just narration. Telling them what I was doing, what the weather was going to do, what I'd seen out in the fields. It was partly habit and partly loneliness and partly the belief, which grew stronger over time, that they were comprehending more than I could measure. In April of year 2, I was talking about the south field, and whether I was going to plow a section of it for oats that spring, and I mentioned I remember this exactly, that E'd need to move the fence line about 30 feet to make the geometry work. Eve, who had been sitting near the barn door looking out at the yard, stood up, walked to the south wall of the barn, and pressed her palm flat against the wood in the direction of the south field. Just held it there. Then looked at me, then looked back at the wall. I set down what I was holding. I walked to her. I put my own hand on the wall next to hers, and I stood there next to her in the April barn, and I thought she heard where I was going to go. She understood that I was talking about a place that was outside this barn. She was telling me she understood. I said, "You know where that is, don't you?" I said it very quietly, and her hand came down, and she turned and walked back to her place by the door, and that was all. But it was enough. That was the day I stopped thinking of them as something I was caring for, and started understanding that we were, in some way, I couldn't fully map, taking care of each other. The third year is where I need to slow down, because the third year is where you need to begin to understand what was really there between us before I tell you how it was taken apart. In that third year, I began to notice patterns of behavior that were so specific and so consistent that they can only be described as personality. Preferences, rituals, the things that made each of them themselves, as distinct individuals, in the way that knowing a person over years makes them irreducibly real to you. Samuel, the larger one by year 3, he had grown to somewhere between 7 and 8 feet when he was fully upright. though he rarely stayed upright for long without specific purpose, had developed what I can only call a collecting habit. Small objects, specifically. I first noticed it when I found a row of smooth creek stones arranged along the top of one of the hay bales in the loft. 7 stones, smallest to largest, perfectly graded. Then a second row appeared below the first. This one of pieces of weathered wood, different shapes. Then a third row with objects I recognized as things from the barn itself, a flat washer, a short bolt, a piece of baling wire folded into a loop. He was not playing. He was organizing. When I moved one of the objects to see what he would do, he replaced it within the day. Always. The arrangement mattered to him in a way I couldn't fully explain but could not dismiss. I started setting objects on the railing of the loft deliberately, things I thought he might find interesting, and observing where they ended up in the arrangement. He turned down synthetic materials consistently. He preferred things that had come from the natural world, or had been used significantly worn metal, old wood, stones from the creek. He had a taxonomy I couldn't fully read, but that was clearly there. Eve was different in her habits and her orientation. Where Samuel was inward-focused, absorbed in the internal logic of his arrangements and the workings of the physical space, Eve was relentlessly outward. She tracked things. Not in the predatory sense. She was not absent or distant the way hunting animals become distant when something interests them. She tracked information. Weather changes registered in her face before I could detect them. She would position herself at specific points in the barn or the yard at specific times of day in a way that, over months, I came to understand was calibrated to what was happening in the environment around the property. She knew when the deer came to the south meadow before I did. She knew when a vehicle was on the road, the public road, nearly 2 miles away before I could hear it. She became my warning system without ever being asked to, because information was what she did with the world. Where Samuel built and arranged, Eve watched and cataloged. And where Samuel's intelligence was architectural, Eve's was almost social-oriented toward the presence and behavior of living things. Of me, specifically. She learned my schedule before the end of month 3. She learned my moods within the first year, which I found more unnerving. When I was agitated from a bad night's sleep, from one of the periodic dark stretches that veterans will understand without needing it, explained she would not approach me but would position herself in my peripheral vision, close enough to be visible, far enough not to intrude. Just present. It was the most respectful kind of companionship I've ever experienced. No demands, no performance of affection. Just a steady, witnessing presence that said, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." I have said that to myself many times over the last 6 years in the dark, and it never gets easier to hear in my own head. There is a specific memory from year 3 that I return to more than any other. It was August, one of those northern Minnesota August nights that are warm enough to leave the barn doors open and cool enough to make the warmth feel like a gift rather than a weight. I had brought a lantern out and set it on a hay bale between us, and I was reading a military history, something about the Pacific Campaign that I'd read twice already, and Samuel was working on his arrangements up in the loft, and Eve was lying on her side near the doors, and outside the crickets were going and the horses were settled and Bauer was asleep against my leg, and I looked up from the book and I looked at all of them, at this impossible family I had assembled in secret, and I felt something that I am going to name as happiness because I think honesty requires that I name it clearly. Not contentment, not just peace, happiness. The specific kind that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly the creatures you are supposed to be with, and knowing it, and letting yourself know it. I sat with it for a long time that night. I let it in all the way. And I think now that that was good that I did that, even knowing how it ended, because those full moments are what you carry when everything else is taken. They become the thing that was real, when everything else feels like it happened to someone else. I am going to spend some time on year 4 and year 5 together, because in terms of practical living, they were the most demanding and also the most complete. By year 4, they were both fully grown, or close enough to it that the difference was immeasurable to me. Samuel stood approximately 8.5 feet, and weighed, based on a rough calculation I made using a livestock scale I rigged up in the barn, somewhere between 500 and 540 pounds. He was not what you would call graceful in the way of a large predator. He was deliberate. Every movement was considered. You could see the thought before the action in a way that very large, intelligent things sometimes have, where the body has learned to wait for the mind to finish. He had a specific way of communicating that was not language in any formal sense, but was absolutely communication vocalizations that varied in pitch and duration, that I had learned to differentiate over years, combined with postural signals that were consistent enough to be read. I knew when he was content. I knew when he was uncertain. I knew when something outside the property was concerning him, because he would stop whatever he was doing and orient north, and his posture would become what I can only call formal. Upright and still in a way he wasn't otherwise. That posture appeared roughly once every few months in years 3 and 4. By year 7, it was appearing more often, but am not there yet. Eve was a smaller 6 feet when fully upright, which was still considerable, but she moved in the low half-crouch more often than Samuel did, which made her harder to read by height alone. By year 4, she had developed what I think of as her primary communication mode with me touch and placement. Not affectionate touch, not casual or constant, but specific and deliberate. If she wanted me to follow her to something in the yard or the field, she would brush my forearm with the back of her hand and then move in the direction she wanted me to go. If she was indicating a concern, she would place her palm on the ground in front of her and hold it there. If she was indicating something was resolved or safe, she would put her hand on my shoulder briefly and then remove it. These were not behaviors I taught her. She developed them as a lexicon for managing me. I understood this and I accepted it. I was being managed by a creature I could not name for anyone, and the management was so consistent and considered that it would have put most human communication to shame. The feeding operation by year 4 had become its own logistical challenge. Between the two of them, at full size, I was supplying the equivalent of approximately 2 full deer carcasses per week in protein, supplemented with what I can only describe as bulk large quantities of dried corn, root vegetables from my own fields, occasional grain. I hunted heavily. I had a walk-in cooler installed in the back of the barn under the pretense of processing livestock, which it was also used for. I had a system with 2 commercial hunting operations 60 and 90 miles away, respectively, for purchasing processed venison and elk that I picked up in my truck with a plain cargo shell on the back. I spent somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year on their food alone, which wiped out most of what I made farming and required me to liquidate a significant portion of my savings over the 9 years. I do not say this as complaint. I say it because I want you to understand how committed the decision was. I was not passively maintaining a situation. I was actively, deliberately, at significant personal cost, choosing to sustain it year after year. Every year was a choice made with full awareness of what it was. The 6th year is when I need to begin to be honest about the fractures, because they were already there in year 5, and I was already refusing to look at them directly. I am going to tell you what was happening, and I'm going to be as honest as I can about what I knew and when I knew it, and what I told myself that let me keep going. Samuel killed a dog in the spring of year 5. Not Bauer had died of old age in year 4, which was its own grief I don't have room to fully describe, but a hunting dog that had come onto the property from somewhere, following a trail, and gotten into the barn through a gap I hadn't secured properly. I found it the next morning. Samuel was not distressed. He was in the loft, working on his arrangements, and when I came in and saw what was on the barn floor, he looked down at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not guilt, not fear. Watchfulness, waiting for my reaction. I stood there for a long time. I said, out loud, Samuel, just his name, and he held my gaze and I held his, and eventually I nodded. Not in approval, in acknowledgement that I understood. That was my second real mistake. I had established a rule, unspoken, but as real as any rule I'd ever kept. This stays contained. This doesn't go outside the property. By nodding, I told him I would absorb it. I told him the rule had exceptions. I should not have done that. But I did. The second fracture was Eve's response to a person. In year 6, Harvey Peterson needed to drop something at the farm when I wasn't at the house to meet him. Not the barn, the driveway, and the barn doors were closed, and Eve was in the barn. I came back to find Harvey's truck gone and Eve pressed flat against the east wall, still and rigid in a way I'd never seen her. And when I opened the barn door, she moved past me so fast I had to step back to keep my footing. And she went out into the yard and circled the area around the driveway 6 times, smelling before she came back inside. She was not in distress. She was conducting an assessment. And when it was done, she came to me and put her hand on my shoulder and held it there longer than usual. What she was communicating I couldn't parse with certainty. But what I felt in that moment was she is telling me someone was here. She is telling me she knows that. And she is watching to see how I respond to that knowledge. That was the moment I understood that the containment of our situation was becoming, in her mind, something that required active management rather than passive continuation. She was not frightened by the possibility of discovery. She was prepared for it. And the thing that prepared her was not fear. It was calculation. In year 7, Samuel began disappearing at night. Not every night. Maybe once every 3 weeks, then once every 2 weeks, then weekly. I would do the evening feeding and closing and come back in the morning and find the east side door unlatched from the inside. He had long since mastered that. And Samuel would be in the loft, always when I came in. Always back before 6 in the morning. Always. I told myself it was natural ranging behavior. I told myself that 900 square feet of barn and 93 acres of mostly fenced property wasn't sufficient territory for a fully grown adult of his kind, and that what he was doing was taking what he needed and returning, and that the returning was what mattered. He always came back. Always. I said that to myself every morning for almost 1.5 years. You know what's coming. I knew what was coming. I said it anyway because the alternative was doing something I wasn't ready to do. Eve did not go with him on these nights. This distinction mattered to me more than I knew how to explain at the time. Now I think she stayed for a reason that had to do with me, and with the long assessment she had been running since the day I found them, and with a conclusion she had reached about which one of us needed watching. Whether she was watching him or watching me, I genuinely don't know. Maybe both, probably both. She was always awake when I came in those mornings, positioned near the door, and she would look at me, and then look toward the loft, and then back at me. And that combination of looks communicated something I received clearly, even though I refused to act on it. She was telling me what she thought of his absences. She didn't approve, and she thought I should know. There were signs in year 7 and year 8 that I won't detail individually, because listing them creates a false order that doesn't match how it actually felt to live inside them. What it'll tell you is that it was cumulative. A deer carcass I found at the edge of the south tree line that I hadn't put there. Mud prints outside the perimeter of the property that I found once and never found again, but couldn't stop thinking about. A local news item on the radio in October of year 8 about a hiker reported missing in a forest area 45 miles south. Never found. That I turned off after 30 seconds and never turned back on. I know what that sounds like. I know exactly what it sounds like. I need you to understand that at the time, I was still telling myself a story, and the story required that some things not be looked at directly. That is not an excuse. It is an account of how a man who has lived most of his life by a moral code can find himself making exceptions, one small rationalization at a time, until he is standing in a place he never would have chosen to stand if he'd been shown it at the start. The rule, the original, unbreakable rule, was that they always came back before dawn. Always. For a year and a half, through 43 or 44 separate nights out, Samuel was back in the loft before 6 in the morning. And then, in the February of the 9th year, he wasn't. I want to tell you about the morning before I tell you about the February morning, because this is the part that I think about most and the part that I think matters most, even now, even in everything else. The night before Samuel didn't come back, the last normal night was a quiet one. Temperature around 20, clear sky, the kind of northern winter night that is almost beautiful in its severity. I had done the evening feeding, and I had sat with them the way I always did, the lantern going, the horses settled. Samuel had his stones and his arrangements laid out on a flat piece of plywood had brought up into the loft for him, working through something I couldn't see the logic of but had learned to appreciate as an expression of how his mind moved. Eve was near the doors, which she always preferred when the temperature was cold. She liked to watch the winter yard, the blue dark of the snow under the night sky. I was reading, and at some point in the evening I looked up, and Eve was looking at me. Not at the yard, just at me, steadily, the way she sometimes looked at me when she was trying to communicate something that didn't fit into the vocabulary we had built together. And I thought, looking back, that was the moment. That was her trying to tell me. I put it down to the cold or the late hour or my own tiredness. I said goodnight to both of them in the way I always did, which was by saying each of their names once clearly and touching the barn doorpost on my way out, and I went inside, and I slept better than I had in months, which I have spent considerable time thinking about since. The next morning, February 14th. I remember the date because of how cruel the precision of it felt afterward, the way specific dates can become weights. I came to the barn at first light, and the east door was open and the loft was empty. Eve was on the ground floor, not at the doors, seated in the middle of the floor, upright, facing the east wall, and she did not look at me when I came in. That was new. In 9 years, Eve had always looked at me when I came into the barn. I stood in the door for a moment, and then I walked around to face her, and I looked at her face, and what was in it was something I recognized and didn't want to recognize. It was what human faces look like when they already know something they haven't told you yet. The held-back knowledge. The waiting for you to get there on your own, because the telling will break something. I said, "Where is he?" Not a question. She looked at me. And then she looked at the east wall, the direction of the south tree line. I went out into the snow. I followed the tracks, his tracks, unmistakable, the span and depth of them east across the yard and through the fence line he'd been unlatching for a year and a half, and into the south timber. I tracked him for 4 hours in the February cold. The tracks went deep into the forest, past the point where I knew my own property, past points I had walked before. They became harder to follow where he'd moved through the thick timber, but I kept them. And then, at a point approximately 2 miles into the forest, on a south-southeast heading, they stopped, not at a destination, not at a kill site, not at a den. They just stopped. Boot print to nothing. in the middle of a clearing in the winter forest with fresh, undisturbed snow on all sides. No blood, no sign of struggle, no tracks coming in from another direction. No explanation I have been able to construct in 6 years of trying. He was there, and then he wasn't, and whatever took him or whatever he followed into wherever he went, I found no record of it in the snow. I stood in that clearing for a long time.